Okay, well, welcome to AP Government Review number 1. In this session, we're going to go through the Constitution and just sort of the basics of the Constitution, the document itself, what's in the document, that sort of thing, a little bit of the background, because that's where really it all began. The foundational piece of government in the United States is the Constitution. So let's begin by talking a little bit about the background of the Constitution. As you know, the Constitution was drafted in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. It was ratified about a year later in 1788, and during that time in between when it was drafted and when it was ratified, we had the Federalist Essays, or the Federalist Papers, as they're sometimes called, which were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And those were published as newspaper editorials in states where there was some dispute about whether the Constitution was going to be ratified, and in an effort to encourage those states to ratify it and to explain what the Constitution was all about and why it was a good way to go. The Constitution was drafted largely in response to the failings of the previous governing document of the United States, which was called the Articles of Confederation. Without going into a whole lot of detail about it, the Articles of Confederation was lacking in many ways. It was, the national government was way too decentralized. Almost all the power was in the hands of the states. It lacked sufficient power to regulate the economy, so the economy was flailing. And also it lacked the ability to maintain order, law and order throughout the country. So once the Constitution was ratified in 1788, the new government of the United States went into effect in 1789. And one of the major changes from the Articles of Confederation to the constitutional government was that the new Constitution established a federalism-style government, or federalist-style government. And in a federalist system, you have a split and a sharing of authority between the national government and the state governments. So rather than having it almost all concentrated in the power in the hands of the states, now it's going to be fairly equally split and shared between the national government and the states. And the national government, by virtue of that, had much more extensive powers under the Constitution than it had had under the Articles of Confederation. And these are just a few of the places where it enjoys those powers. Through the Commerce Clause, has the ability to regulate all sorts of activities under the heading of interstate and foreign commerce. The Elastic Clause allows the national government now to have a whole range of unwritten powers that are related to its enumerated or expressed powers. So that's those we call implied powers. We get those from the Elastic Clause. And then finally, the Supremacy Clause. When there is a dispute between state governments and the national government, as long as the national government is within the bounds of the Constitution, it wins in that confrontation. So that's what the Supremacy Clause says. All right, let's begin looking at the document itself by looking at the original Constitution, which consisted of 7 articles. We'll just take a brief look at what each of those articles is all about. Article 1 begins with the powers and duties of the legislative branch, which we know as the United States Congress. So it lays out the 2 chambers and what their functions are and what all the powers of Congress are. It's quite an extensive article. It is by far the longest article within the Constitution, and that's because there was a lot of groundbreaking there, a lot of new duties and responsibilities that had not previously been under the heading of the Congress. Article 2, shorter, but it describes the powers and duties of the executive branch. Mostly the president and vice president. Article 3 is shorter still. That goes over the powers and the duties of the judicial branch. Now, as it was originally written, the only federal court that was established was the Supreme Court, but it also included in Article 3 a method by which the Congress could create and adjust the jurisdiction of additional federal courts. Article 4 is mainly about interstate relations. This is where you're going to find rules for how states are supposed to relate to each other and interact with each other. For example, the full faith and credit clause and the privileges and immunities clause. Article 4 also talks about how to add new states and provides a requirement that all state governments must be Republican, meaning they have to have representative governments. Article 5 includes rules for amending the Constitution. And if you remember, amending the Constitution is a two-stage process. Amendments are proposed by 2/3 of either the entire Congress or a special constitutional convention at the national level, and then they're sent out to the states, and 3/4 of states have to ratify an amendment for it to take hold. Article 6 includes the Supremacy Clause, as we mentioned before, which is the idea that federal laws, the Constitution, and federal treaties are the supreme law of the land. It also includes in Article 6 a requirement that there be no religious test for any public office in the United States. You cannot be required to be a member of a particular religion. And then Article 7 included the rules for the original ratification for the Constitution to take effect. All right. So one of the things that took place during the debates over whether to ratify the Constitution was that the anti-federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, eventually extracted from the Federalist supporters of the Constitution a promise that during the first Congress they would include a series of amendments that we together call the Bill of Rights today. So these were the first 10 amendments were added during the first Congress, adopted in 1791. So let's briefly go through the first 10 amendments of the Constitution that we call the Bill of Rights. First Amendment, really action-packed, loaded amendment that includes lots of our most treasured freedoms like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of petition. Second Amendment, as most people know, is the right to bear arms. Third Amendment says that you cannot be required to quarter soldiers in your house. Fourth Amendment protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. That's why they need a warrant. Fifth Amendment includes several important things. Most people know it for the freedom not to be required to incriminate yourself, i.e. I plead the fifth. But it also includes a guarantee that you will be protected under the due process of law. You get all certain steps that everybody is accorded in the legal process. Also protects you from what is called double jeopardy. You can't be prosecuted for the same crime twice. Sixth Amendment includes several rights for the accused in the legal setting, including the right to a speedy trial, the right to a public trial, right to a jury of your peers, if you so choose. Seventh Amendment, a lot of the same things, but in a civil case context, so in a lawsuit, the same kind of protections. Eighth Amendment protects you from excessive, cruel, and unusual punishment. Ninth Amendment, kind of a catch-all that says that just because something is not listed as a protected right in the Constitution, that doesn't mean that the government automatically has a right to violate that right. So we do have rights beyond what is explicitly mentioned here. And then the 10th Amendment, sometimes called the Federalism Amendment, states that anything that is not specifically delegated as a power to the national government is reserved as a power to the states. So this creates that dividing line between state and national powers. All right, just a couple things, final things about the Bill of Rights. As we mentioned before, it's adopted by the first Congress as a demand by the anti-federalists during their debates over whether to adopt this. The first 10 amendments are largely the source of your civil liberties, and civil liberties are protections against government actions. And on that topic, interestingly, a lot of people don't know this, the original understanding in the legal context was that the Bill of Rights only protected you from actions of the federal government. But beginning with a case called Gitlow v. New York, the Supreme Court kind of changed its tune on that, and it started a process called selective incorporation, by which the protections of these amendments could be applied to cover you against actions of the state governments as well. All right, just a few final things here. There are 27 amendments in total, but you can see here we don't have all of the others listed here. I've just picked out a few of the most well-known amendments, most important amendments. So the 13th Amendment bans slavery and involuntary servitude. 14th Amendment, really important, maybe the most important amendment on this list. One of the things it did was it provided that citizenship is automatic for anyone born in the United States or its territories. It also, really importantly, extends due process protections and equal protection of the law to cover you against actions of the states. 15th Amendment provides the right to vote regardless of race. 16th Amendment permits the federal government to assess a personal income tax. 17th Amendment provides for a direct election of U.S. senators, so it changes the way that they are elected. 19th Amendment says you have the right to vote regardless of your sex. That gives women the right to vote. 22nd Amendment provides a 2-term limit on presidents. 24th Amendment, another civil rights amendment that bans poll taxes. 25th Amendment provides a method of filling a vacancy in the vice presidency, and also a way of temporarily removing an incapacitated president from power. And then the 26th Amendment provides the right to vote regardless of your age, as long as you're 18 or over. So a couple things here. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are all passed either during or in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. So these are largely kind of civil rights focused amendments. We could also throw the 24th Amendment in as a civil right amendment. Very important. And I mentioned earlier that the 14th Amendment is really critical. That is where, referring back to the previous slide, this is the amendment that gives the Supreme Court the ability to do that thing that we call the incorporation doctrine. They use that protection for due process and equal protection to extend Bill of Rights protections to the actions of the states.